We're just waiting a few minutes for everyone to get out of the waiting room, and we'll start shortly.
Okay.
Okay, I want to thank everybody for coming to this press briefing on the second Chicago mayoral poll that's being hosted by the Center for the Study of Diversity and Democracy at Northwestern University, the Hispanic Federation, Illinois Black Advocacy Initiative, Latino Policy Forum, and Latino Victory Project. Before the briefing begins, a few notes. This webinar will end at approximately 10:30 a.m., but panelists will stay as long as needed if questions run over that time. Journalists, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and identify your outlet, your question, and indicate whether the question is directed to a particular panelist. Spanish translation will be available for questions submitted in Spanish. A recording of this webinar will be emailed to you after the session has ended, along with contact information for the panelists for follow-up questions. We ask you to follow along with the presentation with the slide deck, with the top line survey results that is going to be pasted in the chat for you right now. It was also included in the press release that went out right as the conference was about to start. So the run of the show today will be an overview of the survey's methodology and key findings. Those will be presented to you by Matt Barreto, the president and co-founder of BSP Research, and Jaime Dominguez, associate professor of instruction, Department of Political Science, and the Center for an associate affiliate with the Center for the Study of Diversity and Democracy at Northwestern. After their presentation, brief presentation, the rest of the panelists will join them for the Q&A. So now I'd like to turn it over to Professor Dominguez.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Our poll, I think, is going to shed some light on just kind of where the electorate are at and where our voters are thinking, given that the election is just a few days away. And secondly, I'd like to also thank our partners, Latino Policy Forum, Hispanic Federation, Latino Victory Project, and the Illinois Black Advocacy Initiative for partnering with us on this important research project. So first things first, I just want to first and foremost put this election and our poll within kind of the national and local context in a way that Chicago, in many ways, I think connects to what's happening at the national level. So first and foremost, we feel that this election is about a competition of ideas centered on issues such as crime, law enforcement matters, immigration, taxation, race relations, which all connect to what we see happening in Congress and state legislatures, but also in urban settings, Chicago being no different. Secondly, it's also, I think, a phenomenon of intra-party politics, I think, is at play here, particularly within the Democratic Party. So what we see in Chicago is basically a jostling, an ideological jostling playing out within the Democratic Party. First, I think the notion of progressivism is on the ballot. The emergence of, for example, newly elected, younger left-leaning elected leaders, particularly amongst Blacks and Latinos, is challenging the vision and priorities of the status quo within the Democratic establishment. And it's actually pitting kind of old school versus more moderate progressives going forward into the running our city. We also see a generational gap at play, so that's important. And last thing I would say that in a tri-port city like Chicago, the future of effective governance is going to be dependent on the inclusion right, of multiracial coalition building across race, class, and gender. In terms of just some overarching themes of the poll, we like the poll, I think, speaks to the following. It speaks to crime and what to do about it, how to solve it. Secondly, it's about inflation and the cost of living, which is pretty much on everybody's mind these days. Also, it's about how demographic factors are driving vote choice in Chicago. We also look at turnout gaps. There's as the slides will show, there's a interesting phenomenon going on there. Also, it speaks to just the uneven outreach efforts that we've seen from, or haven't seen from both campaigns. It also speaks to candidates' qualifications. And yes, that experience does matter, but that's not what's all on the mind of Chicago voters going in the next week or so. And lastly, the poll really speaks to this kind of, again, as we saw in our first poll, which is high degrees of perceived commonality between the Black and Latino communities. Okay, so before going into the actual results, I'd like to ask my colleague, Professor Matt Barreto, to just speak briefly on just the survey methodology, and then we'll segue into the results.
Great, thank you, Dr. Dominguez. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. My name is Matt Barreto. I am the president and co-founder of BSP Research. We served as the data collection polling firm to collect this data for the city of Chicago under the direction of Dr. Dominguez and others at Northwestern University, and the collection of advocacy groups that were mentioned. I'm just going to give a brief overview of how the poll was conducted, and then turn it back over to Dr. Dominguez to run through the results. This was a survey of 1,500 Chicago voters, 1,500. That is the largest poll that has been conducted this cycle in the Chicago mayor's race. Respondents who said that they probably or definitely won't vote were excluded. So this is not only, quote, likely voters, because we believe that predicting turnout is very difficult in a local election. And so anyone who said that they are 50-50, probably or definitely will vote is included, but we did exclude those people who said they probably won't vote. The overall margin of error is 2.8%. This poll, like our first poll, also featured an oversample with a statistically large and viable sample of both Black voters and Latino voters. That gives us the ability to break out results with large samples of each of these important minority groups. But then, of course, the final data are weighted to match the census estimates and demographics of the Chicago voting electorate, so that those data are balanced to match the city profile. The survey came out of the field on March 23rd, so it was very new and recent data. Respondents were interviewed via cell phone, text message, email, online panels, and self-administered the survey. It was available in English or Spanish, and a large percentage of our Latino respondents did choose to take the survey in Spanish. And as I mentioned before, this is a follow-up poll to a poll that we did during the primary, which also fielded a large oversample of racial and ethnic minorities. Those are the poll highlights. I'm going to stick around. If there's any specific methodology questions, I'll be happy to answer. But for now, I'm going to turn it back over to Jaime Dominguez from Northwestern University.
Thank you, Dr. Barreto. I appreciate that. All right, so what we're going to do is I'm going to go in order of the slides. So the first slide I'm going to reference is the one on likelihood of voting and race. I'm not going to go through every single facet of that slide, but just I think some important takeaways from that slide. So in terms of the reported mayoral vote by likelihood of voting and race, we see that the race is super tight, right? It's pretty much up for grabs. But we do see a little bit of evidence of some racial bloc support. So for example, what we see is the majority of whites are supporting Paul Vallis, 51%, while the majority of Blacks in Chicago are supporting Brandon Johnson at 55%. However, with respect to the Latino vote, not surprisingly, what we see is a plurality among Latinos, the Latino vote. So for example, we see 46% of Latinos saying they're going to vote for Paul Vallis. At the same time, 35% are saying that they're going to vote for Johnson. So what I think that tells us is that, again, there's still a lot of fluidity within the electorate. And in particular, when it comes to Latino voters, that they can be courted and they still are, or the candidates have the ability to make more inroads with this electorate. In terms of the second slide on turnout gap, what we see is that the majority of Black, 73%, and the majority of whites, 74% of voters, say that they are definitely most certain to vote, whereby only 60% of Latinos say that they will vote, right? So what this implies is that if these Paul Vallis and Brandon Johnson want to increase their share of the Latino vote, it's important, right, over these next few days that they really engage in effective kind of GoTV efforts to bring these voters over to their camp, or to at least speak to the issues that are going to get them to actually vote for them. Okay. In terms of slide number 3, which talks about the actual issues, not surprising, right? Reducing crime is the #1 top priority for all groups, albeit higher for Blacks, 53%. For Latinos and whites, inflation / cost of living comes in at second, 35% to 31% respectively. For Blacks, police reform and accountability comes out at #2 as a #2 issue for them, and that's at 30%. Okay. The fourth slide in terms of candidate qualifications, in terms of just Vallis supporters versus Johnson supporters, with respect to Vallis supporters, 75% say that they're voting for him because he would do a better job, versus Johnson, it's only 67%. 68% believe that Vallis would do better on the economy, compared to 64% for Brandon Johnson. In terms of experience, 66% say that Vallis has the experience to do a more effective job, versus 53% for Brandon Johnson. And in terms of who's best able to address the needs of the poor and working class, Paul Vallis comes out at 58% versus Brandon Johnson at 68%. In terms of the next slide, the fifth slide, opportunity for increased voter contact, we find a striking result here, whereby 47% of Latinos and 46% of Blacks say that they have not been contacted by either campaigns. And compared to whites, it's 38%. So that's not to say that they have not been contacted at all, Latinos and Blacks, but there is, again, an opportunity for both campaigns over these next few days to really engage this electorate. And also when you do that, I think it sends a message, right, that they're an important electorate, that they bring a lot to the table, and that they should be part of the conversation and discussion about what happens in the city of Chicago. Okay. In respect still to this voter contact, what we also find is that in terms of age and income, those making $80,000 or more, and those voters between the ages of 18 to 29 report the highest level of contact, compared to 53% of those making less than 40,000 and older than 65 who say that they have not been contacted. So we do see a little bit of differences there in terms of income and also age bracket. The last couple of slides I want to turn to speaks to the Black and Brown commonality. That's something that we covered in the first poll, and we thought it was important to do so again, given that back then we had a plethora of candidates, now it's down to 2. Nevertheless, though, that percentage in terms of high degrees of perceived commonality between Blacks and Latinos has not changed. For example, 75% of Latinos and 73% of Blacks say that they have a great deal or fair amount in common. Also, in terms of Latino and Black partnerships, 74% of Latinos and 71% of Blacks say that it's better to work together as opposed to working independently on their own issues. So the implication here, I think, is whoever wins the mayorship next week I think, it really needs to pay attention to the 2 communities, because in many ways they do see these issues that voters care about, and that really these 2 communities also care about, right? That they also they need to work together, right? So there needs to be kind of this collective multiracial effort. And so the challenge, I think, is going to be for both candidates, basically transitioning their kind of multiracial electoral coalition into an effective governing coalition. Okay. Now, in terms of just major takeaways, in terms of what this poll really tells us, I think it says the following. One, it says that the race is too tight to call, meaning that the election is still up for grabs, even though we just have a few days before the general election. Secondly, reducing crime is still the top issue and the top priority for all voters. Right. Third, outreach efforts have been uneven. Right, Blacks 46% and Latinos 47% had the highest share who say that they have not been contacted by either campaign, while that's not the case for whites, where it's only 38%. Fourth, I think what our poll tells us is that each campaign must engage in effective GoTV efforts if they want to increase their electoral share and support amongst African Americans and Latinos. Okay. Also, fifth, I would say Latinos and Blacks, again, as I just mentioned, they have a really high degree of perceived commonality. Another takeaway, I think, is that Latinos, and this is kind of a little bit concerning, but Latinos display the lowest share of voters most certain to vote. So again, as I mentioned in the slide in terms of outreach, I think that both campaigns really need to step up their efforts over the next 2 days or next few days to increase their share and to create more inroads within this community. Because again, it's not just whether or not they're going to vote for them. Yes, that's important, but should that person, whoever gets the largest share and wins, right, I think has to be cognizant of this community in terms of their priorities and what they want, particularly as they become a larger share of the electorate and more importantly, a larger share of the city's population. Okay. And lastly, I would just say that the Latino vote is up for grabs. While yes, tilting slightly towards Paul Vallis, there still is an opportunity, I think, for Brandon Johnson to close the gap. So those are the takeaways from our poll. Now, for Spanish language media that may be present, I just would like to just in Spanish just say what the 7 principal conclusions are from our poll. So los 7 conclusiones principales de nuestra encuesta son: primero, la elección está bien apretada entre Johnson y Paul Vallis, significando que la elección está en juego para los dos candidatos. Segundo, reducir el crimen sigue siendo la máxima prioridad para todos los votantes, pero especialmente para la comunidad negra. Para los latinos, inflación y el costo de vida es la segunda prioridad. Para los negros, la reforma policial y rendición de encuestas es número 2. Tercero, los esfuerzos de divulgación han sido desiguales. Los negros 46% y los latinos 47% tienen la proporción más alta que dice no haber sido contactado por ninguna de las campañas. No es el caso para los blancos, solo 38%. Cuarto, cada campaña debe participar en los esfuerzos de GoTV si quiere aumentar su apoyo electoral, particularmente entre los votantes latinos. 5, los latinos y los negros comparten en un alto grado de similitud. 6, los latinos muestran la proporción más baja de votantes más seguros de votar. Y el último punto es que el voto latino está en juego. Mientras se inclina hacia Paul Vallis, Johnson tiene la oportunidad de cerrar la brecha. Okay, so I basically just summed up the major points in Spanish for our Spanish language partners. So what I'd like to do now is just turn to our partners to see if they want to provide just a brief point about the survey. And I will give the floor to Sylvia Puente, CEO and President from the Latino Policy Forum first.
Thank you, Jaime. Stephanie, did you want to introduce everybody?
Certainly, yeah. I'll just call the other panelists to turn on their cameras at this time. Roberto Valdez Jr., Midwest Director for Policy at Hispanic Federation, and Patrice James, Executive Director, Illinois Black Advocacy Initiative.
Great. Well, really, again, we want to thank Professor Dominguez and Professor Barreto and BSP for, I think, this unprecedented poll that oversamples both Black and Latino voters in this historic election here in Chicago, as well as thank all of our partners who have just been introduced. I just want to underscore a couple of things I think that have been highlighted. We found one of the things that was very interesting that we found that you can find in the top line survey is we started hearing concerns that some, well, I won't say concerns. We started hearing that some voters might think that Valles was Latino. Double L in Spanish is Valles. So we actually polled for that. And interestingly, we found that 1/3 of Latino voters thought that Valles may be Latino. We also found that 1/3 of Latino voters, higher than other groups surveyed, believe that it's very important that the candidate really understand who I am and understand my community. This combined with the nearly 50% of Latino voters who have not yet been reached, or Latino potential voters who have not yet been reached out to in the campaign, I think really puts the onus on both campaigns to conduct outreach to the community. But once elected, whoever our next mayor is, really requires that the candidates reach out, forge alliances, create inclusion, so that the Latino community can be truly represented and reflected in our city's future. I also want to mention that we also did ask, in addition to the good news affirming that most of the Black and Latino respondents, well, over 70%, feel that our communities have a lot in common and that it's important to work together. So the Latino Policy Forum certainly affirms that, and it's part of core of what we do. And we look forward to that in this partnership and future partnerships in terms of really understanding that our communities have much more in common and have a lot to do to work together in common. And lastly, I just want to highlight that the poll also did reaffirm something we found in the first poll, is that over 80% of the respondents thought that it was really important to address the current migrant crisis in a humane way. And we look forward to working with the next mayor on that issue as well. Thank you.
I'll go next. Just want to echo Sylvia's gratitude to Dr. Dominguez and Professor Barreto and everyone at BSP Research. Again, Roberto Valdez Jr., I am the Midwest Policy Director with the Hispanic Federation. And just want to reiterate a point that Dr. Dominguez highlighted in his summary, and that's the fact that 47% of Latino voters and 46% of Black voters reported not being contacted to mobilize their vote. I think this sheds a very powerful light on the need towards candidates and campaigns to reach out to the Latino and Black vote. And with only 1 week left, especially with the campaigns out doing their get out the vote efforts this next week, they do have a responsibility to engage the community on the ground and for them to use culturally and linguistically relevant messaging to empower communities to participate in our democracy. I will translate my remarks in Spanish. Buenos días, mi nombre es Roberto Valdez Jr. Yo trabajo con la Federación Hispana, soy el director de política del Medio Oeste. Voy a repetir un punto que dijo doctor Domínguez sobre el hecho de que 47% de los votantes latinos y 46% de los votantes negros reportaron que no fueron contactados para movilizar su voto. Esto dice que se necesita fomentar del voto latino y el voto negro, ¿no? Y con solo una semana hasta la elección, todos, especialmente las campañas, tienen la responsabilidad de hablar con nuestras comunidades y utilizar mensajes para movilizar a la gente a que voten. Gracias.
Morning, everyone. Patrice James, the Illinois Black Advocacy Initiative. I apologize in advance for my daughter, who may not be entertained much longer by Miss Rachel as I try to get through this. But I echo many of the comments that my colleagues have made, but also want to address the overwhelming support and concern that Black voters have with crime and public safety. And while it is been reported ad nauseum that, crime, public safety is a top issue for all voters and that it is a top priority issue for Black voters. Black voters are equally interested in quality of life type policies, like accessible childcare, transit stops in their neighborhoods, and funding for public schools. I think that these candidates, in addition to talking about public safety, also need to focus on the quality of life type policies. Black voters are extremely interested in those. And quite frankly, when we think about these quality of life policies and issues, those actually have a direct impact on public safety and crime. And I think Black voters also, demonstrated by this poll, recognize that when they overwhelmingly support addressing root causes, in which we know that these these quality of life type policies get at. So, while the conversation continues and people still are very concerned about crime, we also need to be talking and making sure that these candidates need to be talking with some specificity on quality of life public policy, because that is in many ways the other side of the coin to public safety and crime. Thank you.
We have a question here from one of the media for panelists. Perhaps Jaime or Patrice would like to take this. Mariah from the Sun-Times asks, with the Black vote largely headed to Johnson, according to the survey, would Vallis endorsements from Black leaders and aldermen be enough to sway? Do the survey results show Black voters will be firm in their support for Johnson?
Well, I think what the poll shows is that, yes, I mean, the African American community, the Black community, no doubt about it, is overwhelmingly supporting Brandon Johnson, but that's not to say that Paul Vallis can increase his share of the Black vote. The endorsements he's been getting, I think, also displays a generational gap that we also see with the Latino vote, where you have the kind of old Black political guard, former Senate President Emil Jones, retired Secretary of State Jesse White, throwing their support behind Paul Vallis. Perhaps that could help him in terms of more than likely these are kind of older voters who maybe have more of a history of participating in the political process, probably have worked within government of previous administrations, particularly within the Democratic machine. So there is an opportunity perhaps for him to maybe increase his share, but is it going to substantially tilt the scales towards Blacks coming out in droves and supporting Paul Vallis? I don't see that happening.
Are there any other questions from media? Please type them in the Q&A on the bottom, and I will ask them to the panelists.
While we're waiting, Stephanie, let me highlight that one of the other things that I found interesting in the poll was that we asked the question about progressive voters and in terms of characteristics. And the number one response was that respondents said that they support a candidate who was progressive and who is fighting for progressive issues. 37% of candidates said yes to that, and that was the highest among a variety of characteristics that we asked about, with experience as an elected official at 36%, right behind that. So I think that also is sort of interesting as we talk about this election in terms of Chicago's electorate being progressive. And so that even with both a progressive and a moderate individual running, the majority or 37% of the respondents said that a progressive candidate working on progressive issues was important to them.
So just a reminder to attendees that a recording of this webinar will be emailed out to you, as well as a link to the slides and as well as contact information for each of the partner organizations for follow-up questions. If there are no further questions, I guess, oh, wait, let me check looks like there are, sorry. A couple more questions. We have a question from Tessa Weinberg. Paul Vallis has said the election is not about race. What kind of role do you think race has played in the runoff election in particular? That's for any of the panelists that want to field that.
Well, I would just say this in terms of it's not, he said it's not about race, but remember, Chicago is one of the most hyper-segregated cities in the United States. And historically, in terms of from a governance perspective, we see, in fact, right, that particularly Black and Brown communities have been kind of disproportionately and negatively affected, right, by some of the decisions, right, that the previous administrations have made, whether it's with regards to health, mental health, whether it's regards to pre-K education, workforce opportunities, infrastructure building. That it does matter, right? And so therefore, it's not surprising that we see, in fact, right. Granted, there's not like extreme kind of linear racial block voting, but we do see kind of right, and from what we've seen in the poll so far, right, overwhelming majority of white voters are supporting Dallas. Not surprisingly, Brandon Johnson, majority of the Black vote. I think the key here, I think it's going to be the Latino vote, right? Because again, even though Latinos are not considered a racial group, right, they are racialized, and so their experience could mirror perhaps on some of these issues that I mentioned, similar to African Americans, and in fact, from a symbolic representation standpoint, right, that matters, right? And so in the city that's, again, a tripart city, a third Black, a third white, a third Latinos, right, that government in many ways should reflect that, not just the leadership, but also the investments and also the agenda setting, right? So I will couch it that way.
I want to just echo what Professor Dominguez is saying, and that we don't see the hyper-racialized voting that I think we have seen certainly in past elections, but we definitely see 51, and I think what's most interesting to me is 51% of white voters said that they were supporting Vallis, but 49% aren't, right? So we don't see the hyper-segregation that we have in the past elections, but we definitely still do, I think, see, as Professor Dominguez is indicating, racial Black voting with the majority of Black respondents still saying that they plan to vote for Johnson, and with Latino voters really being up in the air. But again, with Latino voters being up in the air, I just think it's so interesting that a third of Latino voters said that they think that Vallis may be Latino and that they would vote for a candidate who has similar views to them and is a co-ethnic candidate. So we don't know to what extent that is really influencing the distribution of Latino voters, the plurality of whom say that they are voting for Vallis.
But to that, I also will say, in terms of the co-ethnic variable and the effect of co-ethnicity and impacting voters, that in studies show, in fact, that if it's a Latino candidate versus the non-Latino candidate, they have the same qualifications, the Latinos will overwhelmingly support the co-ethnic candidate. And even more so in a situation like Chicago, where it's kind of a first time, right? Where, for example, at least when Choi was running, right, the fact that there was a potential for the first time ever in the history of the city of Chicago to elect a candidate, right, of a separate national origin, perhaps same language. So that variable is actually pretty strong. And so the fact that, again, in our poll, that a third of Latino voters actually think that that Paul Vallis is Latino, there could be that residual effect, right, playing out also, right? Because at the same time, we don't, even though it's out there, the candidates, the campaigns know that, right? We don't see Vallis and his supporters saying, "Oh no, that's not the case," because they understand, in fact, that could be working to his advantage.
We have another question for the panel. This may be for Matt Barreto. This is from Amy Yee at Bloomberg. And the question is, can you share anything about where poll respondents live in Chicago? Also, what the income range was for respondents.
Yeah, sure. And I'd be happy to follow up with any reporters, journalists who have additional questions about the methodology or want to see additional crosstab breakouts. So the poll is sampled across the entire city of Chicago and weighted to balance to the population across the different neighborhoods. We did ask a question at the start of the survey of respondents to self-report which of the 77 community areas they lived in, using the list from the City of Chicago and the University of Chicago. And then we ensured that we had the right balance of persons from across the entire city. We did the same thing on income. So we had a question about household income, your own educational attainment, these sort of socioeconomic demographic questions. And we've broken out the results by those to see how voters of different socioeconomic status, age, gender, and you heard the panelists discussing race, of course. So the most important thing is that the survey is balanced. It is matched and weighted to the census estimates of the demographics of the city of Chicago. And it is sampled, the 1,500 person survey is sampled from across the entire city.
Thank you. Last call for questions. Looks like we have one more here. A follow-up question from Bloomberg, from Amy. Any thoughts on racial ethnic groups that are not Black, Latino, or white? What about Asian, Middle Eastern, and other voters, especially those who are limited English speakers?
I would just briefly say around that point, regardless what race or what community, I think candidates need to identify these communities and speak to them again in the cultural and linguistic right way. So whether Asian, Middle Eastern, et cetera, I think those efforts are important, not just for Latino voters or Black voters around that point.
I'll just say in terms of the sample, the population outside of the three largest groups is very small in the electorate. It accounts for less than 6% of the rest of the electorate. I think Asian Americans account for about 3 or 4% of the electorate. So they are included in the survey. It is a part of the overall demographics, but not large enough in size to break out statistically valid samples.
All right, I think that concludes the questions and the press conference. Thank you all for joining us today, and please watch for the recording of the.
We
Oh,
do have one more question, I believe.
oh, we do. Sorry. Thanks, Kristen. All right, this is from Sky Patterson from the Southside Weekly. The question is, in the survey, does Latino include both non-white and white Latino voters, or just the former? How was this question asked?
Yeah, we allow respondents to self-report their race and ethnicity however they see fit. So you can check more than one box. We follow the same parameters as the census that currently Latino is seen as an ethnicity. In the results that we report out for Latino, it is anyone who self-selected that they consider themselves Latino. They could have selected a race category differently.
All right, thanks so much. Again, we'll send the webinar. Oh,
Stephanie, if I can real quickly, also at the beginning, I forgot to mention, I also want to thank Al Tillery, our executive director of the Center for the Study of Diversity and Democracy at Northwestern, for providing the support and the infrastructure and the platform to be able to facilitate this great project with our partners.
excellent. Excellent. Thanks again for joining us, and watch your inbox for the recording and the slides, and reach out to the panelists with any follow-up questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.